Hello and welcome to the demo video presentation of our group project titled BraiNet by Group 11. The objective of the project is user identification through brain signals using a mobile application called Thought ID developed in Android and fog and remote servers which are set up in Python and Flask. In this video, we are going to demonstrate the registration as well as authentication process using the EEG data file of the respective user. Let's dive right in. We have developed a minimal UI which contains fields for the user to enter their username as well as select their EEG brain data file. And there are two buttons for a new user to register and for a returning user to log in. Let's first register our new user into our database. I'll select the EEG brain data file for that respective user and I'll press on register. The mobile application sends the username and the EEG data file to the backend database and stores it. We also display a toast which indicates that the user registration was successful when we receive the success response from our database. Now let's try and authenticate the user we just created. We'll choose the same EEG data file which belongs to the user and press login. This opens up a new intent which says that our user has been authenticated. We also display a bunch of other parameters such as the battery level at the start and at the end of the database request and the time taken by our mobile app and server to authenticate the user. We can also see that the application's adaptive offloading technique works successfully as it was authenticated by our fog server. This calculation is done based on the battery level as well as the network connectivity of the phone in a particular environment. Now let's log out and try to register the same user with a different EEG data file. As you can see that the server has responded that the user ID is invalid or the EEG data file and the user ID do not match. Let us now take a look at the event log of our fog server. In the Android application demo, we had first made a request to register the new user which is received by the server right here. It is a post request as we submit the user info and brain data to the server for creating a new entry. Then we made two login attempts which are post request as well as we submitted the EEG data file to the server for feature extraction and authentication. All three requests show the status code as 200, which means that the request was processed by a server successfully. Now let's take a walkthrough of our Android code. Our Android code contains two main classes, Authenticate and the entry class which is main activity. When the user clicks on the app, the onCreate method gets called and it renders the UI for the user to enter their user ID and selecting the EEG brain data file. When the user selects the register option, we send the information to the database where a new entry is made. We also call the remote and the fog server to update their information. If the user selects the login option, we first extract the main attributes from the user's device, such as the battery levels as well as the network connectivity. Using this parameter matrix, we decide whether to send the data to the local server or the fog server for execution. If the database responds with a yes, then we say the user has been successfully authenticated and call the authenticate class to display the various parameters after logging in successfully. If the user authentication fails, we display a toast saying that the user ID is invalid. Now, let's take a look at the Python Flask code for fog and remote server authentication. The application sends the login ID or new user registration request along with the EEG brain data signal, and the server authenticates it in the backend. This is the server.py, which is the entry point into the backend code. We have a bunch of functions to pass and process the data. Then we have the authorize user ID function where we create an instance of the DB helper class. This DB helper class is defined in dbhelper.py, where we have written a bunch of methods to fetch and insert data into our database system. It performs numerous operations such as insertion of user info as well as brain data, batch insertions, as well as fetching the data to and from the server. The next important method in server.py is the login ID. Over here, we fetch the brain data as well as the session ID from the request made by the application, and then we call the authorize brainwave function. This function calls the run authentication method, which we will use to authenticate the user based on the brain signal. This method is defined in the run authentication.py file. This method first performs feature extraction on the EEG brain data signal passed by the user, and it performs fast Fourier transform to extract the most relevant features. We then provide this data to the SVM classifier, which then predicts the label and sees whether this user exists in the database or not. If it does exist, it will send a notification saying that the user has been authenticated. Otherwise, it sends a user not found request back to the application.